Production funding for this program is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
I'm here with Preston Lauterbach. In 2011, his first book, The Chitlin Circuit and the Road to Rock and Roll, was published by W. W. Norton to widespread praise. It was an NPR Book of the Year. 4 years later, he's come up with a new book, Beale Street Dynasty, a story of sex, song, and the struggle for the soul of Memphis. Preston is currently a visiting scholar at Rhodes College and is right in the middle of a flurry of activity for the launch of this book. We appreciate him taking the time to join us. Preston, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So Beale Street Dynasty, tell me a little bit about this book.
Well, you know, everybody is familiar with what Beale Street is today, the tourist attraction, very successful one, but it had another life. And that was from the end of the Civil War right on up through the Civil Rights Movement. It was known as the Main Street of Black America. And it was largely through the accomplishments of one figure, who I think most of us have probably heard of, Robert Church, known as the South's first black millionaire. But the story details how he put this dynasty together, and I think that it's a lot more complex and surprising than, I know it surprised me to learn all the details of exactly how he did it.
In the late 19th century, between the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century, sometimes we think of that sort of as a dark age and don't really reflect on the diversity of experiences and the richness of that culture then.
Well, it was a time of hope in Memphis when it comes to race issues. It was a time of really unusual progress. I say unusual because you're right. The rest of the South, after the period of Reconstruction, was curtailing black rights everywhere. The right to vote, the right to hold office was almost unheard of. Educational rights, I mean, very basic liberties were being stripped from the freed people. In Memphis, due largely to Mr. Church's power and authority, black culture, black power flourished.
Now, how did you come to this story? What is it that drew you into writing about this topic?
You know, I'm a history man, first of all. I love history. I love a good story. I'm not from Memphis, but moved here and spent about 7.5 years living here and had some, I mean, the place has an aura about it. It's undeniable. And Beale Street is such a big part of the city story. So I showed up, you know, moved here feeling very primed to get into the city's history. And Robert Church really stood out to me as being a really important figure who isn't known throughout the country and yet who had unbelievable influence. So in learning about Church, learning about the Beale Street's, you know, secret and paved over history, it became clearer and clearer to me over time that this was a book-worthy topic and that Church was a book-worthy leading man.
Church Park at the end of Beale Street is
yes,
named for
that's
him.
right. That's named after him. Right. Yeah, one of his many monuments throughout the city.
You talk about Church. That Ida B. Wells is part of this book.
Ida B. Wells, you know, she was another character who I came to with some familiarity. And then living here, I learned that, you know, she was in Memphis for a while, but until I got into the research and started to really put the whole chronology together, I didn't know exactly how Memphis fit into her story. Well, she is one of the founders of the NAACP, one of the great militant journalists in American history. Well, she, as she said, in journalism, I found the real me, and she became a journalist in Memphis on Beale Street. So she really began her journey here. It was formative to what I think is one of the most important careers in journalism history. She became a crusader against lynching and in favor of black civil rights at a time when women nor African Americans were really encouraged to be out there speaking their minds about things. But it was this unusual environment on Beale Street that allowed her to flourish.
Now, there are also some lesser-known figures that we don't think of every day. Pappy Haddon sounded like a very interesting character.
Yeah, I loved getting to know Pappy Haddon. He was a scream. He was also part of what made Memphis an unusual city considering the South after the Civil War, but he was the more or less president of Memphis after the fever and the normal mayor, city council type political structure was done away with. Memphis became a taxing district. It lost its status as a city, and its leader was known as the president of the taxing district. So this was what Pappy Hadden was for about 8 years in the 1880s. So he was president of the taxing district, or president of Memphis, as I like to call him. Head of a bank, head of a cotton firm, and was the judge in police court. Very active man. So he took it upon himself to repopulate and rebuild Memphis after it was mostly destroyed and abandoned during the yellow fever epidemic of the late 1870s, and did so with tremendous flair. He's a complicated figure. All the people in this story are complicated in that, with probably the exception of Ida B. Wells, none of them fit squarely into the hero, villain, good, bad, evil or indifferent category. You know, they all move across these boundaries with great ease. So Hadden, as president of Memphis, allowed for prostitution and gambling to be legalized, which was great for Robert Church's fortune, because that was what he built the dynasty on, was prostitution, gambling, saloons. He eventually went into more positive, socially uplifting projects, but that's really how he made his money. And Hadden, well, I'll put it this way, during the fever, during the plague, everybody who could get out of Memphis did. Everybody could afford to, mainly white people. Black people stayed. They also had an immunity to some degree to the fever, and so they were not as ravaged. You know, it did not take the deadly toll on the African American population of Memphis that it did on the whites. Black people basically saved the city. I mean, they formed militias and that protected people's property from looters, that helped to deliver food and medicine. And so after the fever, you know, the black community had really gained some respect and some appreciation from people like Judge Hadden, Pappy Hadden, who were intent on rebuilding the city. Therefore, in that period in the 1880s, when everywhere else in the South was doing away with black rights, Memphis was really respecting and appreciating its black citizenry. So you had black elected officials, city council person, or really it was a board of public works or something like that, but equivalent to city council, county attorneys, the wharf master, which is an archaic sounding thing, but it was at that time the highest paid public position. That was an African American. So, I mean, you had, you know, the evidence of black leadership and black political participation. This was, I would say, Hadden was the most liberal and the most welcoming of that partnership between the white leadership and African Americans. He also had very liberal attitudes towards law and morals, and so it makes him a very colorful character.
We think we know Beale Street. It is physically still here. It is a popular destination. What are people walking past when they go to Beale Street that they don't know the significance of? What do we see in front of us that we should know more about?
Wow, well, that's a great question. It was a complete civilization. It was everything. You know, it had the saloons, and it had the brothels and the gambling houses, and it had all of the great blues music, but it was a center for African American business. As I mentioned, the political legacy, which really goes on from the late 1800s through the early 20th century as well, and became the center of the most powerful black political organization in the country through Robert Church Jr. I think Church Jr. is probably the most overlooked figure of massive importance in Beale Street's history. At the peak of his political power, it was said that he had a hotline that ran from Beale Street to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. He was so influential in political circles. So 50 years before the Voting Rights Act in the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s allowed for greater black political participation at the polls, Robert Church Jr. was organizing huge black voter registration drives. And people don't know that. That's important. And that's
what years was that?
You know, he started to build this. He first called it the Lincoln League, which was an organization of black voting rights in 1916. By 1920, he was the key Republican official for West Tennessee, and through a truly extraordinary effort, helped to win Tennessee for the Republican Party in the presidential election of 1920. Now, that sounds strange, an African-American Republican leader. Basically, the party identities have been swapped with regard to African-American participation since then. But back in that day, the GOP was the party of Lincoln. Virtually 100% black people who were interested in politics were registered, were Republicans. The Democrat Party was the party of, the Confederacy, more or less. I mean, that was so those identities have changed over time. But in 1920, not a single Southern state had gone for the Republicans in a presidential election since Reconstruction. Tennessee was the first one, largely through the efforts of Robert Church. That's how he built his national prestige. He also went off to organize black voter registration drives in Illinois, Indiana, Maryland. So he spread his influence not only from Beale Street in the city into the state, but throughout the country.
His career at that point is overlapping the beginning of Mr. Crump's rise.
That's right. In fact, another, I think, unknown and forgotten fact is how important Church and African-American voters were to the rise of the Crump machine. And, that is one of the great dramatic and tragic turns in the story of Beale Street's history, because, as I said, Memphis was unusually progressive, not only in the 1880s, but beginning in the 1920s, thanks to Church's power. And Church helped to, Mr. Crump, well, let me back up a little bit. Mr. Crump was mayor from 1909, but then was kicked out of office in 1915, 1916, thereabouts. Actually, he left office in 16 because he owned saloons and wouldn't enforce prohibition and, was supportive of the underworld and vice. I mean, this is how the Crump machine was originally built, through whorehouses and saloons. And got kicked out of office when prohibition became serious in the state of Tennessee. But he was an ambitious man. He was looking to rebuild his power as quickly as it was taken from him. So he looks to this African-American Republican leader, Bob Church Jr., as someone who is on the rise. And the two, from the late teens to the late 20s, made this incredible alliance, black Republican, white Democrat. They should have been at each other's throats, but they worked together. And that, I think, really made Memphis an extraordinary place during that time. Now, their alliance turned into a rivalry, as political situations, I guess, sometimes do. And so what was a great era of hope and progress, a real golden age, transitioned into very dark times.
How so?
Oh, it's complex. It's not only is it complex, but see, we transition from tease to spoil if I give too much of this away, because it is the climactic struggle of the book. Okay. So I want people to say, wow, how did this happen? And then we have to leave that part blank, so they'll run to the bookstore. Yeah.
And you did actually have a chance to, when you were in Memphis to promote the book, to take people on a walking tour of Beale Street. And we have some footage of that.
So Robert Church Sr. is the founding father of Beale Street, the South's first black millionaire. It's hard to imagine, it's hard to picture. It was a beautiful 6-acre sprawling park with a modern auditorium, had beautiful gazebos, peacocks strolling the grounds. Right across the street behind us, this red brick building that is standing, that is the Solvent Savings Bank. That's what it was founded as. That was the first African-American owned bank in Memphis. It was founded in the year 1906.
Minister Sakara Yahweh, formerly Sweet Willie Wine, 1960s street activist, and musician Howard Grimes, drummer for the High Rhythm section, joined Preston Louderback on his Beale Street Seance, just one of the events organized by Rhodes College in mid-March for Louderback's stay in Memphis as a visiting scholar. From Church Park, the group of about 50 people progressed to 340 Beale, the one-time Monarch Club, Jim Kinnane's gambling parlor. Beale Street's illicit economy helped finance political players at the last turn of the century and formed the backdrop for Memphis's developing music culture. Bandleader W.C. Handy had a sheet music hit with Memphis Blues, derived, it said, from a campaign tune written for Crump's mayoral campaign. Handy wasn't the last music man to make his mark on Beale. Rufus Thomas came of age on Beale Street and repaid that debt by helping to bring it back and preserve its heritage. The street just east of Handy Park is named in his honor. Now, I was interested when you came to this project, you had a working knowledge of the history of Memphis and the history of Beale Street. What things did you uncover that really surprised you or really changed your assumptions?
Ooh, yeah, a lot. I mean, you know, I think the beauty of history is the investigation. It is how many mysteries. I mean, every time I answered a question, 10 more mysteries would pop up. So that whole process of investigation and solving mysteries was endlessly intriguing to me. You know, it's little things. There was a story that I found of a man who in the mid-1880s was here gambling and lost all of his money in one of Robert Church Sr.'s gambling saloons, and was talking to Church about it. You know, I lost all my money. What can I do? I can't pay my debts. And Church liked the looks of this guy, put him to work. So for 10 years, this guy was Church's lieutenant. I mean, he was going to all the whorehouses, collecting the rent. It was his job to basically spice up the dice games. You know, if the gamblers in the saloons slowed down or if the games got small, you know, it'd be less lucrative for the house. Well, he had house money to gamble with, and so he would keep the games rolling. He was a very important figure in the church business. Well, one day, took his $100 cash out. That's what he would do to start the workday, get $100 in cash so he could go spice these dice and card games, and got on a train and left. So Church wonders where this guy is, hires the Pinkerton Detective Agency. They find him up in St. Louis working in a hotel. Church says, "We'll bring him back. You know, he owes me this money." Charged him with larceny. Back in the old days, you know, if you and I had a dispute about something, I could just go to the police and I could make a criminal charge against you and they'd arrest you. But so this is what Church did against this man who was living under the assumed name Ed McKeever. Mm-hmm. Well, when Ed McKeever was brought back down to Memphis to face these criminal charges that Mr. Church put against him, it was revealed that McKeever was not a black man. He had represented himself to Church as a black man and had lived for 10 years in the Beale Street dives and whorehouses as a Negro, as a black man. It was revealed that instead he was this white blue blood who came from a prominent family. His father was an attorney. His grandfather was either a senator or governor of the state of Tennessee. The last name was Roane. Mm-hmm. There's still a Roane County if you've ever driven I-40 over towards Knoxville. Oh, yeah. He had prominent relations in Mississippi. So this whole different life was exposed. And you know, you've heard probably about African American people who've decided if they're light-skinned enough and can quote unquote pass for white, they will get out of the South and go to Los Angeles or New York or Chicago and try to make it as white people. Well, here was this prominent white scion of a Southern family who was passing for black. It's completely backwards. So yeah, little stories like that excited me, and that one reminds me of, I know everybody remembers Rufus Thomas, the great Beale Street entertainer, but he had this little joke he repeated a million times, which was, if you could be black for one night on Beale Street, you would never want to be white no more.
So today, the brand of Beale Street is all about music.
Right.
When did that association begin historically?
Well, you know, one of the city's advertising taglines today is home of the blues. And that little phrase with regard to Beale Street was coined in 1915 by none other than W.C. Handy, who is known as father of the blues. Mm-hmm. He started what was perhaps the first black-owned music publishing firm on Beale Street in one of the few buildings down there that's still standing from that time. And he had a partner named, last name was Pace, so it was the Pace and Handy Music Company. And this was before records were widely circulated and other formats of music had developed. And so sheet music was the way that music was bought and sold and circulated. That's how songs were got out. Everybody had a piano and could read music. As I said, very different time. So Handy was in this line of work, and was always looking for new songs and new material, and found very fertile ground in the Beale Street saloons. And he is known today as the father of the blues, controversially to some who think that he was basically going around to these saloons and doing what they call sampling today, getting pieces of songs and weaving it into his own work and putting his name on it. But taking ideas and sounds from other artists and accepting the credit for it himself.
Now, is it true?
That's what he did. But he acknowledged it. So some people are upset about him being known as the father of the blues. If you really read up on Handy, read his own autobiography, I mean, he explains his process. He names his sources when he can. He's forgotten some of them, or he'd forgotten some of them. But there's no such thing as originality. So I mean, I guess if you're really in love with that idea, you probably have some problems with Handy. But I think what he did was really creative and dynamic.
Well, I heard that he had heard a blues musician when he was waiting for a train in Mississippi. Right. Is that a legend, or is that?
That's his story. And I guess that's a bit convenient that he can never remember any of these people's names, right? This anonymous guitar player in Mississippi who I heard years ago was playing this strain. But, he's an interesting guy as well, another boundary hopper. He was a classically trained musician who came to Memphis to lead a band in 1905 or 1906. But he was always fascinated with roots music. He loved all of the very animated preaching that he heard in the churches and the hard clapping gospel music. He loved the blind street singers and little urchin harmonica players. He really drew on all of these folk sources and the saloon piano players.
And one of his first hits was a campaign song for Mr. Crump.
Exactly. So the rise of those two, very significant chapters in Memphis history happened together. The Crump Machine and the blues were born in that 1909 mayoral race when Handy developed the song Mr. Crump. And he used that, I can't remember if it was the melody or what aspect of the song from the guitar player in Tutwiler that he had heard, that you mentioned a second ago, along with different strains of music that he'd heard here. But it was, it was a creative process where he was inspired by folk music, and he was a trained musician, so he could write these things down and make them real compositions. Whereas most of the people that were playing them were just playing them out of the air. They didn't really think about them as products, but he really made the blues. He didn't invent it. He didn't create it. He was not the originator. He was the one who patented it. Like many inventions, it's not just one guy who in isolation came up with the telephone or the light bulb or something like that, but it is, or the television, it's an evolutionary process of different innovative people sprinkling their own ingredients into something, and then eventually it emerges as a whole through that process.
Well, it's our international brand now, Memphis Means Music.
Absolutely.
What made that coalesce in Memphis and on Beale Street? What brought all of these musicians here?
Well, that's a good question too. I think the fact that it was a wide open town where there was a lot of demand. There were plenty of brothels, plenty of saloons and gambling halls and dance halls, and all of these places hired bands. So there was work for musicians. I think it's pretty simple, really. Where there is demand, the supply will meet it, and that is what happened here. It's yet another, I find it uplifting anyway, uplifting side effect of this being, such a low-down, wide-open place.
Now, your first book was on the Chitlin Circuit. This is Beale Street Dynasty. Do you have an idea of what topic you are going to try and tackle next?
Well, I promised you will get the first copy of my next book, but I can speak no further of it.
We have just a few minutes left, so sort of to set the scene, Imagine it was 1920 and we set foot on Beale Street right now. What would we see that would be different? Where would you want to go?
Oh my gosh, where would I want to go? Ooh, that's a good one. First of all, what you would see on either side of the street, which is, you know, basically pretty desolate today, tons of residential properties, you know, big rooming houses and boarding houses all over the place. So the district was very densely urban, very densely residential.
Is the Daisy open?
Old Daisy might have been at that point. Yeah, there were a number of theaters all owned by the Barrasso and the Pacini families.
Now, and they had
owner of
both,
Pee-wee's too.
both music or movies and occasionally live performances.
Yeah, right. Yeah, movies were over there at the Palace. That would be fun too, to go to the amateur night at the Palace Theater. That brought all kinds of great and unusual variety entertainers out of the woodwork. You know, one-man bands, tap dancers, comedians. So it would have been wonderful to get to sample all of the entertainment that was on Beale Street at that time.
Now, was that a friendly crowd, or is that your sort of legendary tough?
That was a tough crowd. That was a tough crowd, yeah. In fact, in later years, when it really got to be a big thing, they had the Lord High Executioner, sort of like the Gong Man on the Gong Show, only instead of a gong, he had a big pistol that fired blanks. So if you were up there on stage stinking it up, he would just shoot you, and you got to go.
That's pretty hard.
Right.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching.